Winter always came early to Maple Hollow, a small mountain town where people measured the year not by holidays, but by the first hard frost. When the ground stiffened and the sky turned the color of old steel, everyone knew what was coming. This year, winter arrived before Halloween, slipping in quietly like it had unfinished business. Emily Carter stood on the back porch with her hands tucked deep into the sleeves of her oversized sweater, watching her breath fog the air. She was 12, small for her age, with sharp, observant eyes that noticed things most adults missed. She noticed the way the trees behind the house had already dropped their leaves, bare branches scratching at the sky. She noticed how the wind sounded different now, sharper, more impatient. And she noticed how long it had been since the house felt truly warm. Inside, Grandma Ruthorn was at the kitchen table, carefully folding laundry with slow, deliberate movements. Her hands shook just a little when she thought Emily wasn't looking. She'd blame the cold if asked, always the cold. But Emily knew better. They had been alone together for almost 3 years now. 3 winters, 3 summers, 3 long stretches of time where the world felt smaller, quieter, and heavier than it used to. Emily's parents had died in a car accident on a slick mountain road. One bad turn in a snowstorm that changed everything. After that, Maple Hollow became the only place left that felt steady enough to stand on. The house had belonged to Emily's grandfather. It was solid, but old. The kind of house that creaked at night and sighed when the wind pushed too hard. The paint peeled in thin, curling strips, and the porch steps slanted just enough to remind you to be careful. It wasn't ugly, it was tired. Emily loved it anyway. She pushed open the screen door and stepped inside. The familiar smell of coffee, laundry soap, and wood smoke wrapping around her. The stove hummed softly in the corner, doing its best, but the chill still clung to the walls. "You cold, Em?" Grandma Ruth asked without looking up. "I'm fine," Emily said automatically. That was the rule in their house. They were always fine. Fine meant no complaints. Fine meant things were under control. Fine meant Grandma Ruth didn't have to worry any more than she already did. Emily hung her coat on the hook by the door and glanced at the calendar taped to the fridge. Red circles marked doctor's appointments, utility bills, and one square in thick blue ink. Heating oil due. The date had passed 2 days ago. She swallowed and looked away. Grandma Ruth finished folding the last towel and stacked it neatly. "You finish your homework?" "Almost." "Good, you stay on top of school. That's your job." Emily nodded, even though her mind wasn't on homework. It was on the way Grandma Ruth had started sitting down more often, catching her breath after small tasks. On the way, she wrapped herself in an extra blanket at night, pretending it was just for comfort. On the way, she'd started saying, "We'll get through this winter," instead of "when winter comes." That shift mattered. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge and shadows filled the house, Emily sat on the living room floor with her math book open, staring at the same problem for 10 minutes without seeing it. The radio murmured softly in the background, a local station talking about an incoming storm system. Temperatures expected to drop into the single digits. Grandma Ruth sat in her recliner, knitting slowly, her glasses sliding down her nose. The lamp beside her cast a warm, yellow circle of light that didn't quite reach the corners of the room. "Grandma," Emily said quietly, are we okay for the winter?" The knitting needles paused. Grandma Ruth didn't look at her right away. When she did, she smiled. A gentle, practiced smile that had smoothed over 1,000 worries before. "Of course we are. Why wouldn't we be?" Emily shrugged, tracing a crack in the floor with her finger. "Just wondering." "Well," Grandma Ruth said, setting the knitting aside, "we've made it this far, haven't we?" Emily nodded, but the answer didn't settle the way it used to. That night, Emily lay awake listening to the house. The wind rattled the windows. The heater kicked on, then off, like it was tired too. She thought about the grocery list taped to the counter, the way it kept getting shorter, simpler. She thought about how Grandma Ruth had started watering down the soup. She turned onto her side and stared at the wall, a knot forming in her chest. She didn't want to be a burden. That thought scared her more than the cold. The next morning, Emily bundled up and stepped outside before school. Frost coated the ground, crunching under her boots. She walked around the back of the house, past the sagging fence, toward the patch of land that sloped gently down toward the trees. It was overgrown now, wild and tangled. but she could still see the shape of something underneath. Rose, her grandfather's old garden. She crouched and brushed away dead leaves with her gloved hand. Beneath them, the soil was dark and rich. Frozen on top, but alive underneath. Emily felt something stir inside her, a small, uncertain spark. Later that afternoon, while helping Grandma Ruth clean out a closet, Emily found an old notebook tucked inside a cardboard box. The cover was soft with age, the edges worn. Inside, neat handwriting filled the pages, diagrams sketched in pencil. Cold frames, root cellars, winter greens. Emily's heart began to race. "What's this?" she asked, holding it up. Grandma Ruth froze. For just a moment, the strong front slipped, and something softer, sadder crossed her face. "That," she said slowly, "is a long time ago." She sat down on the edge of the bed and patted the space beside her. Emily sat clutching the notebook. "Your grandpa and I," Grandma Ruth began, "we had some lean years. Winters where the stores were far, money was tight, and we had to figure things out ourselves." Emily flipped through the pages, eyes wide. "You grew food in winter?" "A little," Grandma Ruth said. "Nothing fancy, but it helped." "Could we do it again?" Emily asked, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Grandma Ruth sighed and reached for the notebook, closing it gently. "Emily, honey, that was different. I was younger, stronger, and even then, it wasn't easy." Emily nodded, her excitement dimming. "I know, I was just curious." That night, as Grandma Ruth slept, Emily lay awake again. But this time, her thoughts were different. Not just worry, possibility. She pictured the empty garden, the old notes, the way her grandmother's eyes had softened when she talked about the past. She didn't know how to grow food. She didn't know how to fix everything. But she knew one thing for certain. She didn't want to sit still and wait for winter to take something else from them. Outside, snowflakes began to fall, light at first, then steady, covering the ground in quiet white. Emily watched them through the window, her reflection faint in the glass. Winter was coming, and somewhere deep inside her, a decision was already taking root. The snow didn't stop after that night. It came softly at first, then harder, thick flakes stacking on top of one another until the world outside the windows looked muted and distant, like a photograph left too long in the sun. By the end of the week, Maple Hollow was officially a winter town again. School buses ran late, cars moved slow, and everyone started talking about how bad this one might be. Emily Carter noticed all of it. She noticed the way Grandma Ruth lingered a little longer over her morning coffee, hands wrapped around the mug as if drawing warmth straight into her bones. She noticed how the grocery bags were lighter when Grandma came home from town. She noticed the way the house seemed to shrink as winter pressed in, every room colder, every corner darker. Emily didn't say anything. She just watched, and she thought. At school, while her classmates complained about snow days and icy sidewalks, Emily found herself staring out the classroom window, imagining rows of green where everything else was white. The notebook she'd found in the closet sat heavy in her backpack, its presence comforting and intimidating at the same time. She hadn't shown it to anyone else. It felt private, important. After school one afternoon, instead of coming straight home, Emily walked around back again, crunching through the snow toward the old garden. The ground was stiff and frozen now, but she knelt anyway, brushing snow aside with bare hands until her fingers burned. "Still alive," she whispered, unsure if she meant the soil or herself. She stood there for a long time, breath puffing, heart racing with an idea that felt too big for a 12-year-old girl, but too necessary to ignore. That evening, Grandma Ruth was napping in her chair when Emily quietly slipped the notebook onto the kitchen table and opened it again. This time, she read more carefully. The handwriting was steady, confident. Notes filled the margins. Simple drawings showed angled glass, wooden frames, ways to trap sunlight and hold warmth. It wasn't magic. It was practical, thoughtful, patient. Emily grabbed a pencil and a piece of scrap paper and started sketching. Her first drawing was terrible. Lines crooked, measurements guessed, but she didn't stop. She erased, redrew, tried again. She imagined the old garden not as it was, but as it could be. A small shelter, something low, something protected from the wind. She didn't call it a greenhouse. That word felt too big, too grown up. She called it a cover. The next day, Emily asked Grandma Ruth a question she'd been practicing in her head all morning. "Do we still have the old windows?" Grandma Ruth looked up from the sink. "What windows?" "The ones Grandpa took out years ago, the cracked ones." Grandma Ruth frowned slightly, thinking, I think there might be a few in the shed. Why? Emily shrugged, aiming for casual. Just curious. Grandma Ruth studied her for a moment, then turned back to the dishes. If you're planning something, don't plan it in secret, she said gently. Emily nodded, her cheeks warm. I won't. But that wasn't entirely true. That weekend, while Grandma Ruth rested, Emily pulled on her boots and jacket and headed for the shed. It smelled like dust and old wood and rusted metal. Sunlight filtered in through gaps in the boards, illuminating stacks of forgotten things. She found the windows leaning against the far wall. 4 of them, cloudy and chipped, but intact. She ran her fingers along the glass, excitement buzzing through her chest. This could work. Over the next few days, Emily began gathering what she could. Scrap wood from behind the shed, bent nails straightened carefully with a hammer, plastic sheeting left over from an old repair. Every item felt precious, chosen with care. She worked in short bursts, always keeping an ear out for the sound of Grandma Ruth's door opening. Her hands grew raw and sore. More than once, she banged her thumb hard enough to make her eyes sting with tears. But she kept going. At night, she lay in bed replaying everything she'd done wrong, everything that could go wrong next. What if the wind tore it apart? What if the cold killed everything anyway? What if Grandma Ruth saw it and thought it was foolish? Those thoughts weighed heavy, but so did the alternative, doing nothing. One afternoon, as Emily dragged a plank across the snow, a voice called out from the fence line. What are you building there, kid? It was Mr. Henson from 2 houses down, bundled in a thick coat, his breath white in the air. He squinted at the crooked frame taking shape in the garden. Emily froze, her heart thudded hard. Just fixing something. Mr. Henson chuckled. Looks like winner's winning that fight. She forced a small smile and went back to work. When he walked away, laughter still shaking his shoulders, Emily felt the sting of embarrassment burn deep. Her hands trembled as she lifted the next board. That night, the wind picked up. By morning, Emily knew something was wrong before she even opened the door. The yard was scattered with debris. One of the windows lay face down in the snow, a long crack running through it like a scar. Her chest tightened. She ran to the garden, slipping once on the ice. The frame had partially collapsed. One side caved in under the weight of snow and wind. The plastic had torn loose, flapping helplessly. Emily dropped to her knees, the cold seeping through her jeans. For a moment, she just stared. All that work, all that hope, gone. She didn't cry right away. She picked up the broken window and leaned it against the fence. She gathered nails, brushed snow from the soil, tried to push the frame upright again. But it wouldn't hold. Finally, the tears came, hot and sudden, cutting tracks down her frozen cheeks. I tried, she whispered, unsure who she was talking to. I really tried. Behind her, the back door creaked open. Emily wiped her face quickly, but it was too late. Grandma Ruth stood there, wrapped in her thick cardigan, eyes taking in the scene with quiet understanding. She didn't rush forward. She didn't scold. She just walked slowly through the snow and knelt beside Emily. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Grandma Ruth placed a warm, steady hand over Emily's shaking one. You didn't fail, she said softly. You learned. Emily looked up, eyes red and swollen. It wasn't enough. Grandma Ruth sighed, gazing at the broken frame. No, she admitted. Not like this. Emily's heart sank. But, Grandma Ruth continued, turning back to her, you don't build something like this alone. Not the first time, and not at our age, yours or mine. Emily blinked. You're not mad. Grandma Ruth smiled sadly. I'm proud and a little scared, but mostly proud. The wind howled across the yard, cold and unforgiving. Grandma Ruth helped Emily to her feet. Come inside, she said. We've got some talking to do. As they walked back toward the house, Emily glanced over her shoulder at the broken structure in the snow. It wasn't what she'd imagined. It wasn't a miracle, but it wasn't the end either. Inside, the house felt warmer somehow. Not because the heater was working better, but because something had shifted. Winter hadn't been beaten, but it had been challenged. And for the first time since the snow began to fall, Emily felt something stronger than fear settle in her chest. Determination. The kitchen felt different after that morning. Not warmer exactly, but fuller, like the air itself was carrying something unspoken between them. Emily sat at the table with a mug of cocoa cradled in both hands, watching the steam rise. Grandma Ruth moved slowly at the counter, stirring a pot of oatmeal, her movements careful but steady. Neither of them mentioned the broken frame outside. Not yet. Finally, Grandma Ruth spoke. When I was about your age, she said, I wanted to fix everything too. Emily looked up. I thought if I worked hard enough, planned well enough, I could keep the world from hurting the people I loved. She paused, then smiled faintly. Turns out, the world doesn't work that way. Emily swallowed. So, I shouldn't try. Grandma Ruth turned, leaning back against the counter. Her eyes were serious now. No, you should try. You just shouldn't do it alone. And you shouldn't rush past the parts that matter. Emily nodded, absorbing every word. That afternoon, they bundled up and went back outside together. The garden looked worse in daylight. Crooked boards half buried in snow, plastic torn and stiff with ice, the broken window catching pale sunlight. Emily braced herself for disappointment. Instead, Grandma Ruth surprised her. She walked slowly around the structure, studying it the way a carpenter studies a half-finished wall. She knelt, pressed her gloved hand to the soil, tapped the wood with her knuckles. You picked the right spot, she said finally. South-facing, sheltered from the worst of the wind. Emily blinked. I did. Grandma Ruth nodded. Your grandpa always said the land tells you where to build if you listen. They spent the next hour talking, not arguing, not fixing yet, just talking. About what had failed and why, about weight, about wind, about how snow didn't just fall, it pressed. That plastic, Grandma Ruth said, lifting a torn edge. It traps heat, sure, but it can't carry load. Not with snow like this. So what do we use? Emily asked. Grandma Ruth smiled, a spark of something old and familiar lighting her eyes. We start smaller and stronger. Over the next few days, winter tightened its grip on Maple Hollow. The roads glazed with ice. School was canceled twice. The radio warned people to stay home unless absolutely necessary. Emily and Grandma Ruth stayed busy. They went through the shed together, pulling out forgotten boards, thicker ones this time. Grandma Ruth showed Emily how to check for rot, how to listen to the sound wood made when tapped. Dead wood sounds dull, she explained, like it's already given up. They carried everything they might need closer to the house, stacking it neatly under the porch roof. Grandma Ruth moved slower than Emily, but she moved with purpose. And every time Emily tried to take something heavy from her hands, Grandma Ruth fixed her with a look. I can still carry my share, she said firmly. Emily learned to let her. They didn't rebuild the frame right away. Instead, Grandma Ruth insisted on planning. They spread the old notebook across the kitchen table, weighing the pages down with mugs and spoons. Grandma Ruth added notes in the margins, her handwriting shakier than it used to be, but still precise. This isn't about beating winter, she said one evening. It's about respecting it. Emily traced one of the diagrams with her finger. So, lower walls? Yes, an angled glass, snow slides. It doesn't sit. What? What about heat? Grandma Ruth tapped the page. Sun during the day, and at night, we use what we already have. Emily frowned. Like the house? Exactly. The idea settled into Emily slowly, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. They worked in daylight only. Grandma Ruth was firm about that too. No rushing, no shortcuts. Emily hated waiting. She hated how careful everything suddenly felt. But she trusted Grandma Ruth. And more than that, she saw something change in her grandmother during those days. An old strength resurfacing, tempered by age but not erased by it. Not everyone approved. When Emily and Grandma Ruth carried boards out back together, Mrs. Collins from across the street stopped her car and rolled down the window. You two building a fort? She called, half smiling. Emily felt her face burn. Grandma Ruth waved calmly. Just tending the garden. In January? Mrs. Collins laughed. Good luck with that. Emily clenched her jaw, but Grandma Ruth didn't respond. She just kept walking. That night, Emily lay in bed, replaying the laughter in her head. Doubt crept in, quiet and sharp. What if they were wrong? What if this was just another way to disappoint each other? The next morning answered none of those questions, but it brought new ones. Grandma Ruth didn't come down for breakfast. Emily found her sitting on the edge of the bed, pale, one hand pressed to her side. I'm okay, Grandma Ruth said quickly, seeing the panic in Emily's eyes. Just need a minute. Emily stood frozen. The room felt too small, too quiet. You should rest, Emily said, her voice thin. Grandma Ruth nodded. I will, but you shouldn't stop. Emily shook her head. I don't want to. Grandma Ruth took her hand. Her grip was warm, steady. Emily, listen to me. Doing this doesn't mean you're ignoring me. It means you're carrying us forward. Emily swallowed hard. That afternoon, Emily worked alone. She measured carefully, cut slowly. Every board was placed with intention. She remembered Grandma Ruth's words, start smaller, stronger, and built the frame lower this time, sturdier, anchored deeper into the ground. Her hands hurt. Her back ached. More than once she had to sit down and breathe through the frustration. But she didn't quit. When the sun dipped low, she stepped back and looked at what she'd built. It wasn't pretty, but it stood. Snow fell again that night, heavier than before. Emily barely slept, listening to the wind howl, imagining collapse and failure. At dawn, she ran outside. The structure was still there, bent slightly, covered in snow, but standing. Emily laughed, a short, breathless sound that surprised her. When Grandma Ruth came outside later, wrapped in a thick coat, Emily showed her every joint, every angle. Grandma Ruth nodded, eyes shining. You learned fast. Emily shrugged, trying to play it cool. You taught me. They still hadn't planted anything. Not yet. The ground was too cold, the nights too harsh, but something had shifted. This wasn't a desperate experiment anymore. It was a plan, and plans, Emily was learning, didn't promise success. They promised direction. As the sun climbed higher, casting pale light across the snow, Emily and Grandma Ruth stood side by side in the yard. 2 generations facing the same winter. It wasn't over, but it wasn't winning either. The days that followed settled into a quiet, disciplined rhythm. Emily woke before dawn now, not because she was told to, but because her mind refused to rest. The cold pressed hard against the windows, but inside the house there was movement again. Purpose. She would pull on her boots, tug a hat over her hair, and step outside just as the sky began to pale, the world holding its breath between night and morning. The structure stood where she'd left it. Each day she checked it first, ran her hands along the wood, pressed gently at the joints, watched how snow slid down the angled surface instead of piling up. It wasn't finished, but it was learning, just like she was. Grandma Ruth joined her when she could. Some mornings she stayed inside, wrapped in blankets, listening from the kitchen window. Other mornings she stepped out slowly, leaning on the railing, eyes sharp despite the fatigue that lingered beneath her movements. Looks solid, she'd say, or that corner could use bracing. Never criticism, always guidance. One afternoon, as gray clouds hung low and heavy, Grandma Ruth surprised Emily by pulling a chair up to the kitchen table and opening the old notebook again. There's something I never told you, she said. Emily looked up, alert. When your grandpa got sick, Grandma Ruth continued, I was terrified. Winter was coming. Money was tight, and I didn't know how I was going to keep us fed. Emily had never heard this story before. I thought about asking for help, Grandma Ruth said quietly, but pride is a stubborn thing. So instead, I built a small cold frame behind the house, just enough to keep greens alive. Her fingers traced the faded diagrams. It didn't work at first. The first storm crushed it flat. Emily smiled faintly. Sounds familiar. Grandma Ruth chuckled, then grew serious. The second one worked better. Not perfect, but enough. Emily leaned forward. Why didn't you tell me? Grandma Ruth met her eyes. Because I didn't want you to feel like it was your job to save me. Emily's chest tightened. I don't feel like that, she said quickly, then paused. I mean, maybe a little. Grandma Ruth nodded. And that's why we need to say it out loud. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was honest. That night, the temperature dropped sharply. The radio warned of another storm, worse than the last. Emily lay awake listening to the wind scrape against the siding, wondering if they'd pushed their luck too far. In the early hours before dawn, she heard a soft knock at her door. Emily, Grandma Ruth whispered, can you come help me? Panic surged, cold and immediate. Emily rushed to her room. Grandma Ruth was sitting on the edge of the bed, breathing shallowly, her face pale beneath the lamplight. I'm okay, she said before Emily could speak. Just dizzy. Emily helped her lie back, hands shaking despite her effort to stay calm. She remembered what Grandma Ruth had taught her. Slow movements, steady breathing. After a long minute, Grandma Ruth's color returned. I hate this part, she murmured, needing help. Emily swallowed hard. You always help me. Grandma Ruth smiled weakly. Then I guess we're even. The storm hit later that morning. Snow fell sideways, driven by wind that rattled the house and erased the edges of the world. The power flickered once, twice, then went out completely. Emily lit candles, hands practiced now. The house grew quiet except for the wind and the crackle of the stove. Outside, she couldn't see the garden at all. Her chest tightened. What if it doesn't make it? She asked softly. Grandma Ruth sat at the table, wrapped in blankets. Then we fix it again. The storm lasted 2 days. When it finally cleared, the yard looked like a different place. Drifts piled high, fence posts half buried, the air sharp and bright under a blue sky that felt almost cruel in its calm. Emily stepped outside first, heart pounding. The structure was still there, bent, frosted, but standing. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Grandma Ruth came out slowly, leaning on Emily's arm. Together they examined the damage. One support beam had cracked. A seam had opened along the base where cold air crept in. "Nothing we can't handle," Grandma Ruth said. They spent the afternoon repairing, working side by side. Emily fetched tools. Grandma Ruth measured and marked. They sealed gaps with old towels and plastic, layered carefully to trap warmth. It wasn't pretty, but it was smart. By evening, the small space held a faint warmth. Not much, but noticeable. Emily pressed her palm against the inside wall and felt it. "It's working," she whispered. Grandma Ruth nodded, eyes shining. "Just enough." That night, they talked about planting. "Not yet," Grandma Ruth cautioned. "The soil needs time." Emily nodded, though impatience tugged at her. Waiting was still hard, but she understood now that waiting didn't mean giving up. A few days later, while Emily was clearing snow from the entrance, a voice called out again from the road. Mr. Henson. He stood there, hands in his pockets, studying the structure with narrowed eyes. "Well, I'll be here," he said. "Didn't expect that thing to last." Emily stiffened, ready for mockery. Instead, he nodded. "You angle the top?" "Yes," Emily said cautiously. "Smart," he muttered. "The snow will slide." He lingered a moment longer, then added, "If you need scrap lumber, I've got some." And then he walked away. Emily stared after him, stunned. That evening, she told Grandma Ruth, who only smiled. "People respect effort," she said, "even when they don't understand it." The following week, they planted the first seeds, not many, just a handful. Spinach, lettuce, hardy greens that Grandma Ruth trusted. Emily pressed each seed into the soil carefully, as if tucking it into bed. "Grow," she whispered, "please." Days passed, then nights. The temperature hovered low. Some mornings frost crept along the inside edges of the structure, delicate and threatening. Emily checked the soil constantly, learning to feel moisture, to judge warmth. Grandma Ruth watched from the sidelines now more often, her strength ebbing and flowing unpredictably. One morning, Emily brushed aside a thin layer of soil and froze. A tiny green shoot pushed upward, fragile but undeniable. She gasped, heart leaping into her throat. "Grandma!" she shouted, forgetting everything else. Grandma Ruth hurried as best she could, breathless by the time she reached Emily's side. Together, they knelt in the cold, staring at the small, stubborn life breaking through frozen ground. Grandma Ruth reached out and touched it lightly. "There you are," she murmured. Emily laughed, tears blurring her vision. It wasn't much. It wasn't enough to feed them. Not yet. But it was proof. Not just that the garden could survive. That they could. As the sun climbed higher, casting pale light across the snow, Emily felt something settle deep inside her. A quiet certainty. Winter was still there. Still cold, still dangerous. But it no longer felt unbeatable. And for the first time, Emily wasn't just reacting to the world around her. She was shaping it. The first green shoot changed everything. It was small, barely taller than Emily's thumbnail. But once it appeared, the garden was no longer an idea or an experiment. It was alive. And that made the stakes feel higher in a way Emily hadn't expected. She began checking the structure first thing every morning and last thing every night. Not out of excitement alone, but out of responsibility. The shoots didn't belong to hope anymore. They belonged to care. Emily learned quickly that growing something in winter wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, methodical, demanding in ways that didn't announce themselves. Some days nothing seemed to change at all. The leaves didn't grow visibly larger. The soil didn't look different. The temperature hovered just above freezing, stubborn and unforgiving. Those days were the hardest. "Patience," Grandma Ruth reminded her gently. "Plants grow when they're ready, not when we want them to." Emily nodded, though waiting still scraped at her nerves. She wanted proof every day that this mattered. Instead, she learned to look closer. She learned how condensation gathered on the inside panels when the sun did its job. How the air inside felt softer, less biting, even when the wind howled outside. She learned that touching the soil too often compacted it, that too much water was worse than not enough, and that warmth could be stolen by the smallest gaps. They adjusted constantly, On colder nights, Emily draped old blankets along the lower edges to keep the heat from slipping away. During the day, she propped one side open slightly, just enough to let excess moisture escape. Grandma Ruth coached from the doorway, her voice calm, precise. "Think balance," she said, "not force." That lesson reached beyond the garden. As January deepened, Grandma Ruth's energy became unpredictable. Some mornings she moved through the house with her old confidence, humming as she made breakfast, insisting on doing the dishes herself. Other days she stayed in bed longer, her voice thinner when she called out to Emily. Emily noticed everything. She noticed the way Grandma Ruth paused on the stairs now, hand gripping the railing. She noticed how her appetite faded, how soup replaced solid meals more often than not. And she noticed the guilt that flashed across her grandmother's face whenever Emily stepped in without being asked. They didn't talk about it directly, not yet. Instead, Emily adjusted her routine. She cooked simple meals, grilled cheese, oatmeal, eggs, things she could manage without fuss. She brought Grandma Ruth tea in the afternoons, setting the mug within easy reach, and she made sure to talk. About school, about the garden, about nothing important at all. The structure outside continued to hold. The shoots multiplied, first 2, then 4, then a thin row of green that looked impossibly fragile against the white world beyond the walls. Emily knelt in the soil, careful with her movements, heart pounding every time she thinned a seedling, terrified of pulling the wrong one. "You have to make space for the strong ones," Grandma Ruth said. "It feels cruel, but it isn't." Emily nodded, understanding more than she wanted to. Not everyone shared their quiet focus. Word had spread around Maple Hollow, slowly at first, then with the kind of curiosity that came from long winters and little entertainment. People drove by slower now. Some waved, some stared. One afternoon, Emily heard laughter near the fence again. Different voices this time. 2 teenagers from town stood watching, their boots sinking into the snow. "Is that a greenhouse?" one of them asked. Emily felt her shoulders tense. "In January," the other added. "That's not going to work." Emily didn't answer. She kept her head down, hands busy, heart pounding. She learned that arguing didn't change minds. They eventually wandered off, bored. That night, doubt crept back in. Emily lay awake listening to Grandma Ruth's breathing from the other room, shallow but steady. The garden glowed faintly in her mind, fragile and dependent. The fear she'd been holding at bay surfaced again. What if this still wasn't enough? The answer came sooner than she expected. Late one night, Emily woke to a sharp sound, something between a thud and a crack. The wind screamed outside, louder than it had been in days. She sat up, heart racing. The structure. She pulled on her boots and jacket, barely bothering to zip them before running outside. Snow stung her face. The beam of her flashlight cut through the darkness, landing on the side wall. One of the lower supports had shifted. Not collapsed, not yet, but close. Emily's breath came fast. Her hands shook as she tried to push it back into place. It wouldn't budge. The ground was frozen solid. She ran back inside. "Grandma!" she called, panic breaking through her control. Grandma Ruth was awake almost instantly. She moved slowly but decisively, pulling on her coat. Together, they stood in the dark, flashlights trembling. "This wind," Grandma Ruth said, voice tight. "It's testing everything." Emily swallowed. "What do we do?" Grandma Ruth looked at the structure, then at Emily. "We reinforce." They worked in silence, muscles straining, fingers numb. Emily braced the beam while Grandma Ruth wedged scrap wood into the base, hammering with controlled, careful strikes. The wind howled, snow swirling around them, like a living thing trying to tear their work apart. Emily's arms burned, her jaw clenched so hard it ached. Finally, the beam held. They stood there for a moment afterward, breathing hard, snow clinging to their coats. "We can't keep doing this forever," Emily said quietly. Grandma Ruth nodded. "No, but we can do it tonight." Inside, Grandma Ruth sat heavily in her chair, face pale. Emily brought her water, guilt twisting in her chest. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to." Grandma Ruth shook her head. "Don't apologize for trying to protect something you love." The words settled deep. The next few days were tense. Emily watched the weather obsessively. She checked every joint, every seam. The garden survived, but barely. Growth slowed. Leaves paled. And then Grandma Ruth got sick. Not dramatically, no collapse, just a fever that wouldn't break and a weakness that kept her in bed. Emily stayed home from school without argument, the decision unspoken and immediate. The house grew quiet. Emily moved through her days with careful efficiency, bringing soup, checking the fire, watering the plants in measured amounts. She felt older than 12 now, not in a proud way, in a heavy one. One evening, as she sat beside Grandma Ruth's bed holding her hand, Grandma Ruth spoke. "You don't have to do all of this," she murmured. Emily shook her head. "I want to." Grandma Ruth smiled faintly. "You always were stubborn." Outside, the garden waited. The next morning, Emily harvested the first leaves. Not much, just a handful. Enough to flavor soup, not fill a bowl. But when she washed them carefully and added them to the pot, the color alone felt like a victory. She brought the bowl to Grandma Ruth. Her grandmother took a slow spoonful, eyes closing briefly. "Fresh," she said, "in January." Emily's throat tightened. She looked away quickly, pretending to focus on the stove. That night, as snow fell softly outside, Emily checked the structure one last time. The leaves inside trembled slightly in the faint warmth, alive and stubborn. For the first time since winter began, Emily allowed herself to believe something dangerous. This might actually work. Not perfectly, not easily, but enough. Enough to get them through. Enough to keep going. February arrived without apology. The cold deepened, sharper than anything before it, settling into Maple Hollow like a weight that refused to lift. The radio called it a historic cold snap. Wind chills dropped well below zero. The kind of cold that didn't just bite, it lingered, creeping into walls, bones, and thoughts. Emily felt it the moment she woke each morning. The house struggled now. The stove burned almost constantly, yet the rooms never quite warmed. Ice traced delicate patterns along the inside of the windows. Even breathing felt different, thicker, slower. Grandma Ruth was still sick. Not worse, but not better either. The fever had faded, but the weakness remained, wrapping around her like an invisible blanket that refused to let go. She stayed in bed most days now, drifting in and out of sleep, her voice softer, her smiles fewer but deeper. Emily adjusted without thinking about it. She learned how to keep the fire steady without wasting wood. She learned which chores could wait and which couldn't. She learned how to read Grandma Ruth's breathing, to know when she was resting and when she needed water or simply someone nearby. And every morning before anything else, Emily went outside. The garden had changed. The leaves were paler now, thinner, growing slower with each passing day. Frost crept along the edges inside the structure every night, retreating only slightly when the sun appeared. The warmth they'd been counting on felt fragile, temporary. Emily pressed her palm against the inside wall and frowned. "Not enough," she whispered. That afternoon, she dragged a chair next to Grandma Ruth's bed and unfolded the old notebook again. She turned pages carefully, rereading passages she'd skimmed before. There, a section she hadn't paid much attention to. Supplemental heat, emergency measures. Emily's heart began to race. She stared at the words, then at the simple sketch beside them. A stovepipe rerouted, stones stacked for heat storage, warmth borrowed and released slowly over time. Thermal mass. Emily sat back, mind racing. That evening, she stood in the doorway of Grandma Ruth's room. "I think I know how to help the garden," she said quietly. Grandma Ruth opened her eyes. "Tell me." "The stovepipe," Emily said. "It runs through the wall before it goes outside. What if, what if we made it pass closer to the garden? Just a little. Not inside, just near enough to warm the ground." Grandma Ruth was silent for a long moment. "That's risky," she said finally. "Too much heat. You could cook the roots. Or start a fire." Emily nodded. "I know, but we're running out of time." Grandma Ruth studied her face, the determination, the fear carefully tucked underneath. At last, she sighed. "Bring me my coat," she said. Emily blinked. "Grandma, you shouldn't." Grandma Ruth swung her legs over the side of the bed. "If we're going to change something this important, I want to see it." They moved slowly, bundled tight against the cold. Grandma Ruth leaned heavily on Emily's arm, her steps short but deliberate. Outside, the air burned. Emily showed her the garden, the frost creeping closer each night, the paling leaves. Grandma Ruth nodded. "You're right," she said softly. "It's not enough anymore." They stood there in silence, breath rising in white clouds. "Okay," Grandma Ruth said. "We try it, carefully." They worked in stages. Emily hauled flat stones from the edge of the yard, heavy, cold slabs that numbed her fingers through thick gloves. She stacked them along the side of the structure, closest to the house, forming a low wall. Grandma Ruth sat nearby on a stool, directing when to stop, when to shift a stone slightly, when to leave a gap for airflow. "Heat likes patience," she said. "Let it move slow." Next came the stovepipe. Emily felt her stomach twist as she loosened the joint, heart pounding with every scrape of metal. Grandma Ruth watched closely, ready to call it off at the first sign of trouble. They adjusted the angle just enough, extending the pipe so it ran along the exterior wall beside the stone stack before exiting. When they finished, both of them stood back, hands shaking, not just from the cold. "That's as far as we go," Grandma Ruth said firmly. "No more." That night, the temperature dropped again. Emily barely slept. She woke every hour, checking the stove, then the garden. She pressed her hand against the stones and gasped. They were warm, not hot, not dangerous, just warm. By morning, the frost inside the structure had retreated farther than it had in weeks. The leaves still looked fragile, but they were upright, alive. Emily let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped in her chest for days. The relief didn't last. That afternoon, the power went out again. This time, it didn't come back. The house grew colder by the hour. The radio went silent. Phones lost signal. The storm outside howled louder, angrier. Emily fed the stove carefully, rationing wood, terrified of burning through their supply too fast. Grandma Ruth shivered beneath her blankets. "I'm okay," she insisted. "Focus on the fire." Emily nodded, but fear clawed at her chest. That night was the coldest yet. Emily layered blankets along the walls, blocked drafts with towels, kept the fire alive with near constant attention. Her eyes burned from exhaustion, her limbs heavy. Sometime before dawn, she stumbled outside again. The wind cut straight through her coat. Snow stung her face. She forced herself to move faster, to think. Inside the structure, the stones still held warmth. The air wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't deadly either. Emily knelt, brushing snow from the base, whispering encouragement like the plants could hear her. "Hold on," she murmured, "just a little longer." When she returned inside, Grandma Ruth was awake. "You're shaking," Grandma Ruth said. "I'm fine," Emily replied automatically, then stopped herself. She took a breath. "I'm tired." Grandma Ruth reached for her hand. "So am I." They sat together like that, the fire crackling, the storm raging outside. Sometime that morning, the sky cleared. Sunlight streamed in, pale but determined. The temperature rose just enough to ease the edge of danger. Emily went outside one more time. The garden had survived. Not thriving, not strong, but alive. She laughed, a sound that came out half sob, half relief. When she came back inside, Grandma Ruth watched her face and knew. "It held," she said. Emily nodded. "Barely." Grandma Ruth smiled. "Barely is enough sometimes." That afternoon, Grandma Ruth slept more peacefully than she had in days. Emily sat nearby, watching the light move across the floor, feeling something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not hope, trust. Trust in what they'd built. Trust in what they'd learned. Trust that even when everything seemed to narrow down to survival, care and knowledge could still make space for life. February wasn't over. Winter wasn't done. But Emily knew now, deep in her bones, that they had crossed something important. They weren't just reacting anymore. They were enduring. March arrived quietly. There was no dramatic thaw, no sudden rush of green outside. Winter loosened its grip the way it had taken hold, slowly, reluctantly, as if it wasn't quite ready to admit defeat. The snow still lay thick in shaded places, and the mornings were sharp enough to sting bare skin, but the light had changed. It lingered longer. It felt less tired. Emily noticed that first. She noticed it when she stepped outside at dawn and realized the sky was already softening from black to gray. She noticed it when the sun reached the garden earlier, warming the glass just enough that the stones held heat well into the afternoon. And she noticed it in herself, in the way she no longer flinched at the cold, no longer counted the days with dread. Inside the house, Grandma Ruth was getting stronger. Not suddenly, not completely, but steadily, like a fire brought back from embers. She sat up longer now. She ate more. She insisted on walking to the window on her own, resting one hand against the sill as she looked out at the small structure that had become the center of their winter. "That little thing," she said one morning, shaking her head with a smile. "I still can't believe it." Emily stood beside her, hands in her pockets. "Me neither." The garden had changed too. What had once been a fragile experiment was now undeniably alive. Spinach leaves thickened. Lettuce unfurled slowly, patient and resilient. The color deepened from pale green to something richer, stronger. Not abundance, but enough. Enough to add to meals. Enough to make winter feel less empty. Emily harvested carefully, just as Grandma Ruth had taught her, Outer leaves only. Never too much at once. She moved with confidence now, her hands sure, her decisions deliberate. She had grown into this responsibility without realizing it. One afternoon, as Emily carried a small basket of greens inside, there was a knock at the door. Mr. Henson stood on the porch, hat in his hands, shifting his weight awkwardly. "Hope I'm not interrupting," he said. Emily shook her head. "No, sir." He glanced past her, eyes flicking toward the garden. Heard Ruth was feeling better. "She is," Emily said. "Thanks for asking." He nodded, then cleared his throat. "Listen, my wife's been talking. She saw what you've got growing out there." Emily waited. "She was wondering," he continued, "if you'd mind showing her how you did it. Nothing fancy. Just the basics." Emily blinked, surprised. Mr. Henson chuckled. "Never thought I'd be asking a kid for gardening advice in the middle of winter." Emily smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. "I can show her." That evening, she told Grandma Ruth, who laughed, a real laugh, the kind Emily hadn't heard in months. "Well," Grandma Ruth said, "look at that. You've gone and started something." Over the next few weeks, winter slowly gave way to early spring. Snow receded from the yard. The ground softened. The air smelled different, damp, alive, full of possibility. Emily went back to school. Her classmates complained about muddy boots and lingering cold. But Emily listened with a quiet distance. She had lived inside winter in a way most of them hadn't. She had learned what it meant to pay attention, to weather, to people, to small changes that carried big consequences. After school, she still went to the garden first. Not because she was afraid anymore, because she wanted to. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the structure glowed warm and golden, Emily and Grandma Ruth sat together on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the light fade. "You know," Grandma Ruth said, "I spent a long time thinking my best years were behind me." Emily looked at her. "And then you reminded me," Grandma Ruth continued, "that usefulness doesn't have an expiration date. Neither does learning." Emily swallowed, emotion rising unexpectedly. "I couldn't have done it without you." Grandma Ruth smiled. "That's the point." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Finally, Grandma Ruth spoke again. "What do you think would have happened if you hadn't tried?" Emily thought about it, about the fear, the waiting, the quiet helplessness that had filled the house before the garden. "I think," she said slowly, "we would have made it through winter." Grandma Ruth nodded. "But," Emily added, "it would have taken more from us." Grandma Ruth reached for her hand. "Exactly." Spring came properly in April. The last of the snow melted. Crocuses pushed through the soil. Birds returned, loud and insistent. The garden structure, once surrounded by white, now stood in a sea of brown earth and early green. Emily planted more seeds, peas, herbs, early greens, using what she'd learned the hard way. Grandma Ruth helped from a chair, offering advice, correcting gently when Emily rushed. They worked together as they always had. One evening, as Emily watered the soil, she paused and looked around. The house was still old. Money was still tight. Life was still uncertain. But something fundamental had changed. She wasn't afraid of the next winter anymore. She knew now that survival wasn't about waiting for help or hoping things would improve on their own. It was about noticing what you had, learning how to use it, and being willing to try, even when the odds felt stacked against you. That night, Emily wrote in the back of the old notebook, adding her own notes beneath her grandmother's careful handwriting. "Winter doesn't have to be empty. Small things matter. Enough can be powerful." As the story comes to a close, the question isn't whether Emily and Grandma Ruth survived the winter. They did. The real question is this: what would you have done in Emily's place? Would you have waited for spring, or would you have tried to create it yourself? And how many quiet winters around us are waiting for someone to notice, to care, to act? If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you love, or of a strength you didn't know you had, consider subscribing to the channel. Because stories like this aren't just about survival. They're about resilience, connection, and the small, determined choices that change everything. And there are many more stories waiting to be told.